Hello students and welcome to today's session of Intro to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In this class, we've been focusing on the doctrines, narratives, history, and practice of these three major monotheistic faiths. Today's class will blend two of our points of focus as we pay attention to narrative and to doctrine. Remember, doctrine is just a fancy word for teaching. So a doctrine of a faith is one of the key teachings of that faith or religion. So the key doctrine or teaching we'll be discussing today is the Christian doctrine that the God of Israel is the same God of the Christian church. You'll want to write that down since you'll see it in exams later in the semester. Now, that's the doctrine, but we're going to study the doctrine by studying two important narratives from the Bible, one from the Hebrew Scriptures and another from the Christian New Testament. Remember that from the Christian perspective, the Hebrew Scriptures can be called the prequel to the New Testament. That's why throughout Christian history, the Hebrew Scriptures have been called the Old Testament. Now, of course, for Jews, it's not the Old Testament at all. It's just the Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, and it doesn't need a sequel to complete it. But since today in class we're focusing on Christian understandings of the Hebrew Scriptures, I'll refer to the Hebrew Bible with the traditional Christian name, the Old Testament. But remember that this is just how Christians understand this text, not how practicing Jews today do. So, one of the questions central to understanding Christianity is getting right the relationship between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. This question is so central, in fact, that Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Jesus lived debated whether they should consider the Old Testament even a part of the Bible, since some of them thought that the God of the Old Testament couldn't be the good and loving God that Jesus had revealed to them as his Father. One early Christian thinker named Marcion wrote arguments in support of this view that the Old Testament and the New Testament God are two different gods. And that's how this theological view got the name Marcionism. One of Marcion's arguments went like this. In the New Testament, God is merciful and compassionate, but in the Old Testament, he's judgmental and wrathful. You can still hear versions of Marcionism in contemporary discussion about the Bible today, in fact. Isn't it true, some people say, that the New Testament God and the Old Testament God are fundamentally different, with the New Testament being one of love, mercy, and forgiveness, and the Old Testament God representing wrath, guilt, and destruction? Well, the question of the relationship between the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament is a very good one. And while Marcion did have some good reasons for raising the question the way that he did, the Christian church as a whole rejected Marcion's view and said, no, the God of Israel is the same God that Christians worship. Sadly, even though the Christian church has historically rejected Marcionism, this hasn't stopped Christians from rejecting the Jewish people and persecuting them in many ways throughout history. And some version of Marcionism has continued to play at least an implicit role in Christian thought throughout the centuries. Because Marcionism has had some really damaging effects on Jewish-Christian relations, it's really important for us to get a grasp of how the Old Testament depicts God if we're going to understand not only the logic and basic claims of Christian thought, but also how to dialogue more fruitfully with our Jewish friends and neighbors. Now, the Hebrew Bible is not one unitary book that speaks with one unified voice. It's a collection of religious writings collected and compiled over centuries by groups with different interests and religious visions. Still, there is a unity in this diversity. Otherwise, the books wouldn't have been collected together in the first place. In one lecture, or even one semester, we probably couldn't do justice to the richness of the depiction of God in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament. But we'll do what we can today. So if we want to start getting an idea of who God is in the Hebrew Bible, the beginning of the Old Testament is a good place to start. The book of Genesis is very interested in showing the reader what God is like. In Genesis, God speaks and acts, often in supernatural ways. But you might also remember a passage early on in the book of Genesis that states that humanity is made, quote, in the image of God. Maybe you've heard that phrase in literature or in church. Maybe someone said, we're made in the image of God. That's why we have human dignity. Well, in the context of the book of Genesis, that verse is an invitation for us to continue reading Genesis with an eye out for how human characters will reveal what God is like. What Genesis seems to be saying is that if we want to know what God's character is, we'll find the answer, at least partly, by looking at some special human beings. That brief intro brings us to the story we'll be focusing on in our lecture today, the conflict between the two most famous twins in the book of Genesis, Jacob and Esau. Maybe you know the story. If not, that's perfectly okay too. I'll tell you everything you need to know for our discussion on Monday. Early in the book of Genesis, God calls a man named Abraham to be the father of a new nation, the nation of Israel, which is going to be a blessing to the entire world, God says. Abraham and his wife Sarah have a son, Isaac, and he carries forward that mandate to be a blessing. When Isaac is old enough to have children of his own, he and his wife Rebekah have twin boys, Esau and Jacob. Esau and Jacob struggle in the womb, the Bible says. And when Esau is coming out of his mother's womb, the story says that the baby Jacob had his hand wrapped around Esau's wrist, almost as if he were trying to pull him back in and come out first instead. That little story encapsulates everything that's going to happen in these brothers' lives. Esau will be constantly outwitted by his brother Jacob, as Jacob does his best to take Esau's place. This will impact their parents as well, as Esau is Isaac's favorite, while Jacob is his mother Rebekah's favorite. Now, since Esau is the firstborn son, he has the right to inherit the leadership of the entire family, as well as all the best from his father's property. In ancient societies, we could call this the birthright or the blessing, and Esau is meant to receive these from his father Isaac. Twice in Genesis, Esau is outwitted by his brother. First, Jacob finds Esau right after Esau has been out hunting. Esau is starving, the Bible says, so he asks his brother for some of the stew that Jacob is cooking. Jacob says, "Sure, but there's a catch. You must trade me your birthright for this bowl of lentils." And Esau says, "If I don't eat now, I'm going to starve to death, so what's the point in having a birthright?" So impulsive and foolish, he says yes, and that's how he loses his birthright to his brother. The next episode is even more tragic. Isaac is approaching his death, and so he asks for Esau to come to him so he can give him his deathbed blessing, passing on to him the leadership of the tribe of Isaac. This is where Rebekah, the mother of the twins, thinks up a plan to make sure that her favorite son gets the blessing and the birthright. Now, Isaac was going blind, so Rebekah tells Jacob to put on some animal skin so he can trick his blind father into thinking that he's Esau. For as Genesis tells us, Esau was a really hairy man. So, while Esau is out hunting for some food so he can give his father his favorite meal before the blessing, Jacob comes in dressed as Esau, and he gets his father's blessing instead. When Esau finally comes back and he discovers what Jacob has done, he utters one of the saddest lines in the Bible. "Do you have only one blessing, Father? What about me?" After he breaks down in sorrow and rage, Esau swears to kill his brother, so Jacob has to flee for his life. But in the middle of this scene, the blind father Isaac utters a prophecy, a prediction, of what's going to go down between the twin brothers who are now opposed to each other. Isaac says, in summary, quote, "Your brother will rule over you, but one day you'll break free from the chains he has tied around your neck." That's what he says to Esau. And remember that point about the neck, as it's really important in what's coming next. So many years pass, and both brothers have married and had children of their own. Some important events happen to Jacob that have had a huge transformational impact on him. Perhaps the most important being that he gets deceived by his own uncle, much like he deceived his brother Esau. After decades apart, Jacob hears that Esau is finally coming his way, and Jacob is certain that Esau is going to get his revenge. So Jacob sends servants ahead of him with a ton of presents to try to appease Esau, to try to calm his rage. Not only that, but Jacob has all his servants speak the following words to Esau. "All these presents are from your servant Jacob, my lord Esau." Jacob is so ashamed, so fearful, so guilt-ridden, that he can't even address Esau as his brother. He has to address him as his lord, and he has to position himself as a servant instead of the family member that he truly is. The tension builds and builds in this part of the story as Jacob and Esau get closer and closer and closer to meeting, and then they finally meet face to face. But instead of strangling his brother or insulting him, Genesis says, quote, Esau ran to him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. This completely disarms Jacob, who was expecting not compassion from his brother, but wrath. And notice how subtle the narrator of Genesis is. The writer notes that Esau fell precisely on Jacob's neck, just as Jacob had symbolically put chains around Esau's neck, according to his father Isaac's prophecy. Isaac had predicted that Esau would be the servant to Jacob, but instead, Jacob has appeared as the servant to Esau. And here's the clincher. Jacob says these stunning words after he's received kindness from the brother he had cheated and wronged. This is what he says. Seeing you is like seeing the face of God, and you have treated me kindly. This line comes pretty much in the center of the book of Genesis, and you can see that it fulfills some of what was promised back in Genesis 1, when it said that humans were the way that you could see God's character in action. Esau may not have the blessing and the birthright, but it's Esau, the abused and tricked and cheated brother, who gets to be the very face of God in the book of Genesis. And that's really important because it shows us that central to the Old Testament picture of God is compassion, just as Christians think that compassion is the central feature of God revealed in Jesus. Marcionism doesn't seem to understand the Old Testament very well on this point. But maybe you're wondering, wait, why did we spend all this time on the Old Testament if we're talking about what's distinctively Christian about the Christian picture of God? Well, when we meet together for our discussion, we're going to look at another passage, this time from the New Testament. And I think you'll be able to see the passage with new eyes now that you have a key insight into who the God of Israel is as depicted in the book of Genesis. So stay tuned, and I look forward to our discussion together.